But let's put these rule illustrations in the context of ethos, pathos, and logos. Why is it that they not only are a good memory device, but what makes them persuasive? How do they enhance the ethos, the pathos, and the logos of an argument? Yeah, Loretta.
Well, I think that by using illustrations, you're appealing to a person's personal experiences or something that has touched them that may help them persuade them to your side of the argument.
Okay, but how? What is that? What component of persuasion is that? It is persuasive, but how? What does it impact? Ethos, pathos, or logos? Rayanne?
I was going to say that when you're talking about a rule illustration, you're trying to relay the logic of the rule over to the reader. So I would feel like it would go more to the logos because you're trying to relay that type of rule in a logical sense, but it's also easy to understand at the same time.
Okay, so yeah, it enhances the logic of the argument by showing concretely that the rule works and that the rule works in a way that makes sense. So it shows the practical implications of the rule, thereby enhancing the logos. Nikki?
I was just going to say what Loretta was saying, how she's trying to have someone relate to a personal, I think it was Loretta, to relate to a personal situation or an emotion or something that would play into pathos.
Absolutely. And so the other way that, the other reason that it works is because it also hits on pathos. Loretta was absolutely correct that it touches on our affinity for story, the fact that we're interested in story, the fact that we process story more readily, which means the rule suddenly becomes easier to understand, which increases both the pathos of the argument and also the pathos of that author-audience relationship. It makes the audience feel more favorably disposed toward the author and the author's argument because the author has injected an element into the argument that makes the argument more accessible. And so it also creates pathos. So we're left with ethos. Does it help us with ethos at all? Dominic?
I feel like it helps you with ethos in a way because when you're hearing the story, as you were saying, you get that emotion and you get that logic by kind of visualizing it, but you get the ethos from it because it's something that not only you're hearing or you're learning, but it's something that you can continue to give to other people that are having a problem understanding it. And it kind of, having it be in a way of a story lets you, like you were saying, understand it, but it gives you that ability to truly think it's truly like, it's hard for me to word this right now. It gives you the ability to truly have that sense of understanding it's real. Because like when you hear stories of things like fairy tales, for instance, like you were saying before, they all have that rule in them where all of the rules that you get from the rules, all of the values that you get from them are real values and they're real things that you're learning rather than just some kind of argument somebody's saying. So I think where ethos comes in is you're trying to relay the story in a way that, like you said, it's emotion, is logic, but also makes it so that the story is viable in a way that the reader has that kind of opinion where they understand it and it becomes their own as well. Yeah. You said a lot there. Two takeaways from what Dominic said. The first one is the form of the response. As Dominic talked about this, and this is something that's important because if you're going to become more deeper and deliberate writers than you have been in the past, it requires that you not just do what comes instinctively and what comes naturally when you write, but that you actually think about what you write. And so what Dominic was doing was talking through it. He had an idea, and he was talking through it until he got the words that he needed.
And the more you do that as you write, the better your writing will be. Now, obviously, you don't want to share that whole thing with the reader. You want to share the result with the reader. And that's why revision is so important. But I think, Dominic, that process that you just went through was a really great illustration of kind of what we do as writers and why it's so important to really think carefully, because we learn so much just from listening to ourselves think. We learn a lot. The second thing is, I think you're spot on about the ethos. Using the rule illustration lets your reader know, this isn't me. This isn't me telling you how the rule works. This is a court taking a real life case, applying the rule to those facts, and coming to a conclusion, and that conclusion supports the argument that I would want you, or supports the conclusion that I would want you to draw, Judge. And so it injects ethos by saying, don't take it from me, take it from the 10th Circuit, take it from the Court of Appeals, take it from the Eastern District of New York. So it does inject ethos. So rule illustration is an incredibly powerful tool because it hits on all three cylinders, and it's really just a ton of bang for your buck. What's funny to me is it's one of the things that students most want to leave out kind of when they're starting out, and that students probably starting out maybe take a little bit less care in drafting, because you understand early on, and it's very difficult to understand until you've done it a few times. You understand early on that you have to include a rule illustration because you've been told to include a rule illustration. But it's hard to understand why it goes in there and exactly how powerful it is. But it is incredibly powerful, and that's why, because it hits on ethos, pathos, and logos. And as you guys know, each component of persuasion reinforces the others. The more credible you are, the more favorably disposed the reader will be to you. So that's ethos reinforcing pathos. The more sympathy you show for the reader, the more likely the reader is to believe that you're credible and logical. So that's pathos reinforcing ethos and logos. So there's a lot of layover. So when you get one technique that hits on all three, and each one of those three reinforces the other ones, that's an incredibly powerful tool. So a well-done rule illustration is really worth its weight in gold in your document. So where can you put those in an argument? If you can use a rule illustration, where are you going to put the rule illustration? Yeah, Rayanne?
I think if I'm trying to put in a rule illustration, just from my experience with the memo, that's one of the most important things you really want to put first to kind of get across to the reader what type of thing you're trying to talk about and how it applies. So I feel for me, it would be one of the first things that I put in.
Okay, so one of the places that you can put it is in the text of a discussion or an argument. Where's another place you can use an illustration? Yeah, Ken.
In a rule parenthetical?
Yeah, absolutely. In a citation parenthetical. So you can have a lengthy rule illustration that goes in a textual discussion like Rayanne was talking about, or you can have a very short rule illustration that just goes into a citation parenthetical. We're not going to go over sort of the technical aspects of signals and parentheticals, but I have posted for you under this week's materials a PowerPoint that I use in the first year to talk about signals and parentheticals and to talk a little bit about the strategy of signals and parentheticals. So if you want a quick way to review those things, that PowerPoint is up there for you, and you should feel free to use that. And if you have any questions, let me know. One of the things I'm looking for with regard to rule illustration is your exercise of good judgment and good strategy with regard to, first of all, when to use a rule illustration, and then secondly, when to use one in text and when to use one in a parenthetical. And so you're going to need to know the technical aspects of using signals and parentheticals together. So after you review that PowerPoint, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm happy to answer those. Okay, so 2 places we can put them. We can do a lengthy one in rule explanation, or we can do a shorter one, a bolstering one in a parenthetical. Yeah, Dominic.
Couldn't you also, if you're doing like a brief, put it in your short answer, and if you're doing it in your, if you're doing it in your memo, you put it in your short answer, and in your brief, you put in your summary of the argument? Could you try to fit it in there too, or no?
Yeah, that's a great question. Those places are generally reserved just for an expression, a really short expression of our legal and factual theory in some way. And so the short answer in a memo is really just a strict application of the rule to the facts without regard to a discussion of other cases. You'll get into a lengthier discussion in the body of the discussion, so you don't need to talk about it in the short answer. And in fact, at that point, it really distracts from the short answer because the reader's trying to get something quick, just an answer, not an explanation necessarily. A little bit of an explanation, but not a lot. Summary of argument works the same way. You don't really, the only time you would use it in summary of argument is if you've got a case that is directly on point, on all fours, and really just it's binding and it lays out exactly how things should happen. But here's the thing. If you've got a case like that, nobody's spending the money to get to an appeal. So theoretically, yes, you could. Practically speaking, the situation's just not going to present itself. So that's a good question. There are places where rule illustration is really helpful, and then places where it's just a distraction. Okay, so there are 4 functions for rule, or 4 types of rule illustrations. Somebody remember what those were? Yeah, Loretta.
One is for elucidation, to clear up the meaning. One is for elimination, to eliminate any misinterpretations or representations about what you're trying to say.
Right.
That is illustration for affiliation, explaining it to the reader in familiar terms so they'll understand it. And the last was illustration for accentuation, which was to make a dramatic illustration so that it appeals to the reader. Okay, so elucidation and affiliation are really very, very similar. The purpose of elucidation and affiliation are both just to make the rule more concrete, to put it in a context that makes a little bit more sense. Although, for example, affiliation, one thing you can do with affiliation, for example, let's say you have a statutory interpretation argument, as a lot of you do. The rules of statutory interpretation apply whether we're talking about the copyright statute that a lot of you are using, or the ADA statute that a lot of you are using, or a much more simple statute. And so maybe for your rule illustration, you choose a statutory interpretation case that doesn't deal directly with copyright infringement or with the ADA, because those statutory interpretation rules of plain meaning, of adjustum generis, those can be a little bit hairy to explain. And so maybe you take it out of the more complex context of copyright or disability law and put it into an area that's a little bit more familiar to most readers, maybe a family law statute, maybe a wills statute. And so it's still relevant because they still deal with the rules of interpretation, but maybe it's a little bit more familiar context. Using one for elimination is an excellent way to undercut an opposing party's argument. And I describe this in legal process, and I think a lot of people use this terminology as bookend cases, where you show what the rule is and you show what the rule is not. And so that's a really nice way sometimes to undercut your opponent's argument, to show one case that supports your position, another case that supports the opposing party's position,
and then through the rule illustration, and then later the application of the cases to one another, you demonstrate how the opposing party's case actually that's not applicable here. Here's a significant distinction, or here's a misapprehension about how the rule works, or here are some additional facts that were present there that aren't present here. So using a rule illustration for elimination is a powerful way of undercutting an opposing party's argument. And then accentuation, again, to illustrate the consequences of something, to make clearer what will happen if this law is applied on similar facts. So then with rule illustration, your options are, first of all, whether to use one or not. So whether to just articulate the rule alone or pair the rule with an illustration. And then if you choose a rule illustration, the question is, are you going to use it in a parenthetical or are you going to use it in a full text illustration? So I'm going to put you guys into your groups. And what I'd like you to do is talk about exercise 3.2. It is in, hold on. 3.2 starts on page 52 and goes on to 53, 54, 55. If you are in, wait, hold on. Let me find this. I don't know if I gave you guys group letters last time, but I'm going to give you guys group letters this time because we'll use those again. If you are in group A or B, you're going to do exercise 3.2A. And so group A is Greg, Stan, and Randy. Group B is Karina, Marilyn, and Nicole. So you guys are all going to do 3.2A when I put you in your groups. Group C and D will do 3.2B. So group C is Nick, Joan, Ken, and Sean. That's group C. Group D is Mila, Jackie, and Lorraine. So you guys will all do 3.2B. And then the remaining groups, E and F, will do 3.2C. Group E is Ryan, Loretta, and Nikki. Group F is Rayanne, Yusun, and Dominic. So let me put you in those groups manually. Hold on. Apparently, I have to go through this process every single time. Okay. So while I'm doing this, you got, obviously a lot of you are doing it. Read through the exercise that you're going to be doing, because there's some significant reading before you can talk about anything. Yeah, Nikki?
Sorry, I forgot there was another Nicole, and I confused which group I'm in. When I heard you say Nikki, then I realized I wasn't the other one, and I didn't hear the group. So.
You are in group E.
Thank you.
Okay. With Ryan and Loretta.
Thanks.
Okay. Okay, all the rooms are open.
Did we finish first?
Not good.
You're done first.
That's not good.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm going to leave you for a minute. I'm trying to pull together what everybody just sent me for the next exercise.
Okay.
So you guys hang out, and we'll get started when we get everybody back. you guys just hang out here. I think we have, hold on. We have 2 breakout rooms still going. I'm going to give them a couple more minutes. And so if you guys want to take a quick restroom break or something, we'll come back in like 3 to 5 minutes. Oops. Hold on just 1 second. It's been hold on, a challenge to get some folks late breaking entries into these things for your next exercise. Okay, so which group would like to start? we need somebody to summarize 3.2a. Tell us kind of basically what the scenario was that you were dealing with and what you guys decided and why. Yeah, Rayanne, go ahead.
Okay, so what we did is we went through each of the versions individually. The first one, the rule only. Our problem mainly was that, as I said, was one of the points that I brought up, and as well as Dominic and Yusan, is that you see after the sentence, see Wright v. Yurko and Sussman v. Damien, but you don't really know how it relates.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not a law student, you're gonna see it as, okay, so this is a sentence that's there that we don't really understand why it's there. Whereas, as Yusan and Dom brought up, it's a holding of a case. You could see it almost as a holding. I said if they had instead said it was held in these specific cases, it would have made a little bit more sense. So we didn't really like version 1.
Okay.
Version 3 we also did not like because I think Dominic said first that it was just a huge story that could have been condensed very simply, and it ran on too long, and it was very confusing.
Okay.
And, I think we liked the fact that it kind of gave us an idea of what happened in the case, and that was pretty much it. But as I think Yusan and Dom, as well as I said, you read that and then you had to relate back to the actual case, and it was too confusing at that point. So it was just one story, and then you're going back to yours, and it felt too much like a run-on. We all agreed that version 2 is the best.
Okay.
My main concern with it, as well as Dominic's, was the parentheses. We felt like that was odd, having so much information in between the parentheses.
Mm-hmm.
I think we all agreed that if it had a period and then said in Sussman v. Damien, would have been perfect, and it would have flowed a little bit better instead of these huge parentheses sentence or paragraph, it almost looks like. So we definitely felt that version 2 was the best. That was our only complaint about it, and we felt that that was the most effective.
Okay. And then who else did Group E? You guys did the same one, 3.2C. Who's the reporter over there for Group E?
Are we using the same roles we had the last time?
Yeah, reporter. Yeah, the reporter, the recorder, and the.
That's me.
Okay, great. Okay, so Nikki, what did you guys think about it?
We pretty much had the same thought. It was about absolute immunity and defamatory statements and when they're relevant. And the first choice that we had the same situation go on. We thought that it was a clear rule statement, but it wasn't really effective because you didn't understand. There was nothing in the parenthetical that gave us really anything of substance to go on. That wasn't our first choice.
Okay.
For the second version, we thought it was just the parenthetical was way too long. Like at that point, maybe it should have just been in the text because it was really long.
You make a really good point, which is that the purpose of a parenthetical is to give a little bit of information. And so once your parenthetical starts to balloon, it's time to start to think about, is this really an in-text illustration, or do I need to cut down the parenthetical information?
Right, like with it was good, but to that point, it just was too long and it wasn't concise. So we thought that they should have just did it in the text.
Yeah.
And our favorite choice was version 3 because we said that it explained why the cases applied to the rule and why it was relevant to the court, and so that was our choice.
Okay, fantastic. Who would like to go next? Okay, Randy? You guys are Group A, so you had 3.2A.
Yes,
Okay.
we did.
So I'll tell you what, give everybody a second to flip over to 3.2A, and then you can. Okay, so go ahead and tell us about it and tell us what you chose and why.
We chose overall version 2. The reason why we chose version 2 was the first factor was that this was pretty much a pretty easy rule to understand. It wasn't too complex. The rule was basically if you own tools, then if you own tools and you're working for a company, or if you, well, the whole consideration is whether or not you are an employee or independent contractor. And this particular rule turned on whether or not you own the tools. If you own the tools, then you were considered, and you could be considered, an independent contractor. We thought that this rule was pretty important. It was easy to understand. However, the reason why we thought that that version 2 was the best one was that, number one, it was a factor. It didn't define the entire issue. It was just one factor out of many factors to where you could actually consider this to be turning point. So that was one of the reasons why we chose version 2.
Okay.
Another reason why we chose it was that version 2, it was a pretty easy sentence to summarize exactly what the rule was trying to say, or what the rule was actually trying to tell you.
Okay.
And it wasn't too complicated. And when you look at version 1 actually has the rule, has it within the text. It explains everything within the text. And again, we thought that it shouldn't be, just because it doesn't turn on the factor. If this was the important rule, and this rule was the one deciding issue to where the issue could be decided based on this rule, then yes, version 1 would be good. Version 3 is just too long. It's too cumbersome. It explains the case. You don't really need to understand the case or know what the case is talking about. So again, it was just too long in terms of, if you're presenting this to a judge, the judge probably doesn't want to hear you explain the case. So that's why we went with version 2.
Okay, great. Those are some great considerations. I mean, those are all the things you want to take into effect. Kind of, do I need that much information? Does it overtake the main point? Is this, is the rule sufficient on its own? Would it benefit from a little bit of elucidation, or does it need a lot of elucidation? Okay, group B.
Yeah, group B, we did the one with the estoppel.
Okay.
Version 1 we didn't like at all, just because.
Wait. You guys did the one with the estoppel?
Yeah.
Okay.
3.2B, right?
We're group D, Sean.
Oh, I think
We're C.
Exercise B.
Yeah, no. I want group B. Group B.
Sorry, I was just a little excited.
Listen, I understand. It's very exciting stuff.
Yeah.
Nicole, go ahead.
We had some similar thoughts as group A, I think, the Randy's group. We also liked the second choice because we thought it did a great job of highlighting the key aspects of the cited case that were relevant to the argument. And it did it without adding a lot of extra details that could distract from the argument like the last one did. And we thought the first one left all the work on the part of the reader. That's why we didn't like it.
Okay. Very good. Okay, group C. Or wait, Sean, you're group D?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. You guys go ahead and go. Estoppel, Sean, go.
Yeah. All right, so version 1 we weren't a fan of because it's kind of it stated a very broad rule statement to start off, and then didn't really tell us what the cases were about or give us really any information about the law. So we crossed that out pretty much right off the bat. The version 2 and version 3 we both liked for different reasons. Version 2 we ultimately ended up going with just because we thought it was they had the rule of law to begin with, but then what it did, where version 1 didn't do, was it gave us a holding about the case, kind of gave us more of a background and something where it could educate the readers. And we liked how, because they're older cases, They use the parentheticals to help familiarize the case and take the key parts away from it.
Okay.
To educate the reader a little bit. Version 3, we thought it was good. The only issue we had with version 3 was we thought maybe it was too excessive, maybe a little too long.
Okay.
We didn't think you really needed every single part for it, especially when space is such a issue and when you're writing legal briefs, that we thought it was a little too much.
Okay, very good. And group C?
I mean, yeah, we all kind of, like, when we all talked about it, it was all kind of like the same thing. We all agreed with, like, 2 being the right one.
Mm-hmm.
That one of the big things that, like, I think, like, I pointed out was that, like, these cases are from the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
That, like, the judge may be familiar. Like, I don't know if that's, like, the main controlling law, but one of them was from Pennsylvania, and it looks like this is from Florida, this case.
Okay.
So, like, clearly, like, he's not going to be familiar with what's going on in Pennsylvania.
Okay.
So I think the parenthetical is definitely worthwhile. And the only thing, like, I kind of liked version 3.
Mm-hmm.
In the sense that, like, if they were only talking about estoppel and misrepresentation, like, that's the only stuff they're talking about. I felt that they kind of could, like, say a little bit more, because space isn't really, like, that big of a concern then if you're only talking about one topic.
Okay. Okay.
So, I mean, that's kind of, and then everything that Sean said, we were all kind of on the same page about everything.
Okay, great. Okay, so now you guys have looked at some examples, rule only, rule with parenthetical, rule with in-text illustration within the context of a single problem. Now what I'd like you to do is look at your own rule illustrations. And so what I've done is I've taken a rule illustration from each of your documents that you submitted. Next time when we do statement of facts, I'll do something similar. So maybe let's not cut it quite so close. So I've taken a rule illustration from all of the ones that I had. I think I may have missed 1 or 2 of you who submitted just the document without the annotations, just because I didn't have time to do that. So what I want you to do is I'm going to open up the rooms again and let you go back into your groups. I want you to spend the remaining time, and I'll check in on each of you and see how you're doing. I want you to spend the remaining time critiquing each other's rule illustrations. Specifically, I want you to do something similar with what you just did with the exercise. I want you to let the reader know. Some of you have rule illustrations in text. Some of you have rule illustrations in parentheticals. Some of you have only rules with no illustration at all. And so I want you to give each other feedback on whether what you have is effective, whether you might consider parentheticals instead of full text illustrations, or vice versa, whether you might consider taking that full text illustration and paring it back down into a parenthetical. If you have rules only, would it be a good idea to consider adding some illustration to that? And so I've given the rule illustration, and then when you had it, I've given the application of the rule, just so that you guys who are not familiar with the documents can see how it ultimately gets applied, because it's hard to look at those rule illustrations in the abstract without knowing what you're going to do with them. So for those of you who have application in the documents, that's why. It's not to critique, it's just to help you understand what the rule illustration was for. So if you'll all go to Twin under week 3, there's a folder called rule-based, I don't know, something. I can't remember what I called it. And there's a document for each group, and it contains an excerpt. Now, your annotations are not in it. I took those out. Your strikeouts and strike-throughs are not in it. It's just the final version of what you submitted without any editing marks. It's edited, but not the editing marks. So download your group's document, and then get into groups, read what you have, and then give each other some critique. And all of the rooms are open. Okay, so we got one for Hi, guys. Let me see if anybody is still in breakout rooms. Okay, so for those of you I haven't talked to yet, tomorrow night we're going to pick up here. So if you have questions that you want to ask that you didn't get to ask tonight of your group about how you could have used rule illustration better as you think about that tonight and tomorrow, or if you think of additional feedback you might want to give one another, that's where we're going to pick up. From there, we're going to transition into using rule illustrations to undercut opposing arguments. So I'd like you to think about where you could use rule illustration to undercut the opposing arguments. Think about maybe where you didn't do that, or even where you did do it, that you think you did a good job. And we want to talk about where the opportunities are to use rule illustration to undercut. And to some extent, the way that I talked about with bookend cases, where you use one case, a case that supports you to illustrate the rule, but you also use a case that supports the opposing argument to illustrate the rule, but you use it to your advantage. And so we'll talk about that. And then that will let us transition into techniques generally about undercutting opposing arguments, and we'll talk about the Kathy Stanchey Playing with Fire article. And that will wrap us up for the week. Okay. So I'll see you guys later.
Good night.
Good night.